In this video, we are going to create a class to handle gamepad input.
And what are we going to name that class, Logan? I have to know.
Well, we're going to name it simply gamepad input.
Oh, I never saw it coming.
If you remember earlier, of course, we have this keyboard input class. And the idea is that this class is what handles the actual keyboard device, looks for keys to be pressed, and generates relevant events.
Right.
What we're going to do in this video is we're going to do basically the same thing except for the gamepad device.
Right, so they're essentially going to be the same class in that they do the same thing, but there are a few more things you have to take into account when you're playing with a gamepad, or at least some different things.
Exactly. We're going to create our own delegate in order to pass these events back and forth using. We're going to create some events inside of the class. We're going to create a system by which we remember what buttons to look for, and we're going to have an update method to actually scan the state at the proper time.
Gotcha.
Now the one thing we will need to do in addition to everything we did in keyboard is where we had only a single state, because we only ever had a single keyboard, we're now going to need to manage 4 separate last states, so that every time we check the last state, we check the last state of the correct controller.
Okay.
So with this in mind, let's get started on the class. We're going to go down to our input folder inside of the project, and we'll add a new class. And we will call this class Gamepad Input. And we'll give it a second, and then we should load up our new Gamepad Input class. We'll clean up our sub namespace, and we do need to drop a few using statements in place. And just because I'm feeling exceptionally lazy at the moment,
You're going to start copy-pasting, aren't you?
we're going to start to leverage some of the similarities here between keyboard input and gamepad input.
Actually, I'd halfway expected you to just copy the entire class over and start changing names.
It was tempting, but there was the chance that we could get some obscure bugs where maybe 1 or 2 lines here and there would be different.
Oh, I understand why
So-
you didn't do it. I was just, like in the back of my head, wondering, I wonder if he's just going to duplicate the class.
And in this case, it will help to reinforce the concept of device input, where we go from the world of state over to the world of events.
Right.
So let's grab this using statement here in keyboard input and drop that directly into gamepad input. So now we should have access to all of the useful types inside of input. Now, moving down to the class itself. The first thing we'll do is jump up before the class, because we need to declare the delegate that will be used to send these input events. Of course, the gamepad is going to be talking about things in terms of buttons, whereas the keyboard was talking about things in terms of keys.
Sure.
And that is, of course, an entirely different type, and gamepad state is also an entirely different type. So we'll need to have a delegate that is able to handle those types. So we'll make a delegate. The method in question that will be used here is not ever going to return anything, so it will be a void return type. The name of this delegate will be button notice. And then we're going to have the method signature here, where we pass out a specific button of interest, and we will also specify, or rather pass, the entire gamepad state. Again, if whoever is handling this event ends up wanting to see if any other buttons were pressed simultaneously, they'll have the whole state to work with. So we'll drop these in to begin with. So we'll put in a buttons parameter. We'll call that button. Then we'll pass a gamepad state. Jump down here to gamepad state, and we'll call that parameter gamepad state. Now, one more thing that would be useful to whoever is handling this event would be to be able to see what player the input came from.
Sure.
With keyboard, we were assuming that there was only ever one player.
Right. Or at least one keyboard. You can have multiple players on one keyboard, we've already demonstrated, but just one keyboard at a time.
Exactly. But we never had to address different keyboards.
Right.
So on this side of it, we want to be able to pull the player index from which the gamepad was coming in as. So we're actually going to pass in a player index as well. So we'll give a player index called player index. And you'll notice that player index as a type has not yet lit up, and that's because we don't have access to that namespace here at the moment. I'm going to duplicate our using line, and I'm going to make
drop input.
We'll pull input off of that, which is where player index lives.
Gotcha.
So now he should light up. Another way you could look at this player index coming through is we have to use player index to address a controller from the onset.
Right. It's not so much an actual player as it is another device that's plugged in.
Right, because we're in kind of a funny world here where inside of our game we have an entirely different idea of what players are as opposed to actual devices.
Well, here you have to assume that each player represents one controller.
Exactly. And if you think about our input system, really the player index coming off the controller is going to be routed through port. But with all that, the only thing to worry about here is just to make sure that we do pass that information along so we can use it later. All right, now we should be ready to jump into our Gamepad input class. And we will need a series of fields. Now, one of the first fields inside of keyboard input was, of course, the bound keys list. We're going to do the same thing over here inside of Gamepad input. We're going to need to remember what set of buttons we should be looking for, and this will facilitate the main button loop. So we'll make a static array of type Gamepad buttons, or excuse me, Gamepad state. We're not down to the layer buttons yet. We want Gamepad state. This will be an array because we actually need multiple states. We'll call this field last pad states. And we'll go ahead and create a new array here. So new Gamepad state, and we'll say that this array will have 4 elements.
Okay.
So that way
One for each controller.
Exactly. We'll hold a state for each controller. All right, moving on. The next thing we need to do is to hold the list of buttons that we will be looking for on each controller.
This is very similar to what we did over in the keyboard input class.
Exactly, where we had said that we're going to record all the keys we might ever look for and call that bound keys and store it in a list of keys. We're going to do the same thing inside of Gamepad input, where we'll put in a static list of type, in this case, buttons. And we're going to call this bound buttons. And we'll set that to be a new list of type button. Alright, now we need the actual events that will be fired from inside of this class. We'll call these events button press and button release. These will be public fields. They will be
Static events.
In this case, static. And that reminds me of something. So far, we've got this Gamepad class, and we have not yet marked it as static. That's not necessarily a problem, but just to reinforce the nature of it, we will indeed list this class as static.
Okay.
Alright, so back to our field. We have public static. This will be an event. It will be of type button notice, and we're going to call this button press.
And this really is nothing new underneath the sun. We use this exact same technique with our keyboard.
Once again, this is the part where we're at here. We're making our events, so we're going to set up events of type whatever notice is relevant. The keyboard input, of course, that was a key notice. And then we went and filled in an anonymous method just to make sure that we do, in fact, have a method linked in to the delegate. We'll do the same thing here. We'll say that button press is equal to delegate. And then we need to create a method signature matching our button notice. So that is a buttons parameter called button, a Gamepad state parameter called Gamepad state, and finally a player index.
I expect you to copy-paste that, too.
I know, it's...
You just wanted to just throw me for a loop. That's
right.
Nice. Keep me on the toes.
So let's see, we've got all of this put together now, and we've got a little bit of spelling here, finishing this off, and I'm looking at IntelliSense deciding if this is actually relevant yet, because it's not too happy with the fact that we've ended off, and what we're missing here...
Are your braces.
We're missing the method body.
Mm-hmm.
Alright, so we've got all that put together. That takes care of our button press event. Now we can copy and paste that to duplicate it and make a button release. And then everything else will be the same. We have the same blank empty delegate that goes in place. And that should take care of the button notices press and release.
Cool.
Now we're ready to move into the implementation. And we need the same two methods as we had in keyboard input. We need an add method so that we can put a bunch of buttons into our watch list in the form of bound buttons. So let's drop that here. I'm going to put in a public static void method called add button. And then the add button call is going to take in a parameter called buttons, or rather parameter of type buttons called button. And then all we're going to do is add the button to the bound buttons list if it does not already exist. So if not bound buttons dot contains the given button, then we'll look at bound buttons and add to it the button in question. And that should take care of add button.
Mm-hmm.
Now, the one last method we need is our update method. So that way, update by update, we can recheck the state of all of our gamepads and see if any of the known buttons have changed in state. So we'll put together a public static method with a void return called update. Now, one thing we do have to do differently here for gamepads is update will need to be told what gamepad to look at when it goes to check the state. So we're going to take in a player index parameter. And one other implication is that means that whoever is calling gamepad input.update will need to specify which controller to update.
Okay, so as long as we keep track of that, we'll be fine.
But that keeps the code in here one step more simplistic, since we only ever have to worry about one gamepad at a time. Now, inside of our update method, the first thing we need to do is to check the current state of the gamepad. So we'll make a gamepad state local variable. We'll call this pad state, and then we'll gather the current state of the gamepad. So we'll say is equal to gamepad dot, let me get some spelling, pad dot get state. Now when you're dealing with the gamepad, you are required to specify a player index. So we'll pass in the player index parameter that was given to update. So now we've got the state for the current gamepad. Now we can loop through all of the buttons and compare their current state with their last state. So we'll make a for loop. I'll just tab out the template for a basic for loop. We will loop over the count of all of our bound buttons. So bound buttons dot count. And then for each button in here, since some of these lines will get a little bit long with all of the methods that we have to call, we're going to pull each element out of the bounds button list and store it in a local variable. So we'll make a buttons variable called button and set that equal to the current button, which is bound buttons sub I. Alright, now we can perform some of our checks. We can check and see if our state went from being released to being pressed and trigger a button press event. So we'll start an if statement. We'll say that if the current state is down, or rather pad state dot is button down, and then feed in the current button.
And if the last state was is button up,
then we can do that by specifying and last pad state. Now, of course, with last pad states, there's
that's
four.
looking for a player.
In that case, well, yeah, with last pad states, there's four of them.
Right.
So we need to say which one. Well, these can be indexed using player index. So we just directly take this parameter, plug it into last pad states, though a little less direct than you might think. Last pad states is an array which has to be addressed by a number. Player index is an enumeration element. But just to prove what's going on here, we can jump to the definition of player index and see, 0, 1, 2, 3. So we can indeed use these numbers to address the elements of an array.
But we need to cast it.
But we do indeed need to cast it. So we'll cast it to an integer, and then the indexing should work just fine.
That's really clever. I like that.
So now we can close off our if statement. And if this did indeed come back as true, actually if last pad states, jumped ahead of myself. We're not quite done. We've got to ask the state. So we found a state.
Yes.
What about its button? Well, we need to see if the last state's button is currently up. So we'll call is button up.
And we have to feed that button.
So we need to feed in a button, and it's the same one. It'll be the same button variable. So close that off. Then we can close off the parenthesis for the if statement, and that puts our if statement together. I will do one other thing since we're a little bit short on screen space. It may make it easier to read if we drop the second check onto its own line. So if we have check 1, the AND statement, or the AND operator, and then the second check, that will at least make it all fit on screen. Now, if that was indeed the case, we can fire off a button press event. So we'll simply call button press, and we need to pass in what button was pressed. Well, we've got that in the button variable. The current gamepad state, which is pad state, and the current player index, which is the player index parameter. So that takes care of the call for if a button has just been pressed. So we can duplicate the entire check and event trigger.
And then just flip up for down.
Exactly. So now we can say that if the current state for the button is up and the last state for the button is down,
then we'd call button release instead of button press.
Exactly. So button release, but then we feed in the same things, the button variable, the current pad state, and the current player index. Now, once we've finished off our for loop, we do need to remember to update the last state. So we need last pad states, and again we need to address a specific state out of the 4 available. So to do that, we'll cast to int the player index parameter, and then that will give us a specific state, and we'll set that to be equal to pad state. So current state gets stored in the correct slot for our last state. So looking at everything here, let's go ahead and build. And we see no syntax errors. Everything is looking good. So that is going to take care of the gamepad input class.
Cool. So is that going to wrap things up for this video?
It is. This overall topic of gamepad input is actually going to be covered in a few videos. So now that we have the gamepad input class put together, we'll go ahead and call this video.
Okay.